Hey, Whitney. Well, I should say, hey, gloriously awkward unicorn. Good morning.
Good morning, Iris.
Why are we wearing a unicorn outfit? And for people who are listening in podcasts, and you have to go to YouTube and see this unicorn, but why are you wearing a unicorn suit?
Well, there's two reasons. One, I'm wearing an inflatable blow-up unicorn suit because I saw it on Amazon and I thought there's no way you can put that on and still be in a kind of a bad mood. So I ordered it, and it's true. And then I was inspired by our guest, Henna Pryor, who has written about, we're going to talk about this, awkward and embracing awkward. So I thought, how better to embrace awkward than to show up in a unicorn suit?
I love it. Hi, Henna. Good morning.
I love it, honestly. So first of all, Whitney is correct. You cannot be mad at life when someone is talking to you in a blow-up unicorn costume. Second, I've already added one to my cart.
And third, you go.
We've been kind of like pre-show talking for 5 or 10 minutes now, and it's weird how used to it I am.
I know. Well, Iris and I are contemplating, sponsors. Maybe we try and get a inflatable unicorn suit sponsor.
Manufacturer sponsor.
Influencers, listen up.
Exactly. Well, I wanted to formally introduce Henna Pryor to our show. Henna and I know each other from Limitless Minds. We are both room tilters there, but she's an amazing coach, executive coach, and 2-time TEDx speaker. So please go look up her TEDx. And we're so excited because a book is coming out, The Good Awkward. So welcome, Henna. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. Hi, Unicorn / Whitney and Iris. It's so good to see you. Let's give you a little praise. Your necklace is beautiful too, even though Whitney sort of stole the show with the inflatable unicorn. I love your necklace too.
I love it. So we were talking about good awkward. So let's just, I know we set some intentions, but I'd love to just jump in for the audience and say, hey, let's define good awkward. What does good awkward mean? Just at the top of the hour, what does good awkward mean?
Yeah. So the title of the book and the sort of movement I'm trying to galvanize is that we often hear the word awkward as something that is a deficiency, a weakness to fix. Awkward is a bad thing. Feeling awkward is a bad thing. Being awkward is a bad thing. And what I'm hoping to create is an understanding that not only is it not a bad thing, but learning to embrace it, especially where it's useful to your growth. Embracing the good awkward is a catalyst for exponential growth. It's not a weakness to fix. It's your greatest asset for professional growth.
I'm going to just drop the mic.
Here's Whitney. I'm de-unicorned. How do you see the relatedness of awkward and vulnerable?
Yeah, there's a whole section about this in the book, but I'll tell you that when I look at the two, there's absolutely overlap. There's beautiful little Venn diagram that exists. The biggest difference is that vulnerability is higher on the scale of emotional exposure. So vulnerability requires a little bit more of the emotional shell to be removed, to say, this is how I'm feeling. This is what it's meaning to me. Versus awkwardness still has a little bit of that, kind of risk, a little bit of the exposure, but without the emotional exposure. So an example I give is, if 2 actresses show up at the Oscars wearing the same dress, right? Very, specific designer dress. That's awkward, but it's not vulnerable. There's not a whole lot of emotional exposure happening there. And awkwardness, in my opinion, and sort of research supports it as well, is that awkwardness is a stepping stone to vulnerability. If people cannot stay in the awkward, messy middle, then reaching for true vulnerability is always going to feel out of reach and in worst cases be performative. So we've got to do this awkward bit first.
Can you give us, I love stories. So a little bit of your story of how did you get to this place of, what, good awkward and embracing awkward. How did we get here?
Yeah. Your story, the story that begins with me, again, without going too deep, is child of immigrants, mom born in Pakistan, dad born in India, always felt like the odd one out. I lived in an area that was predominantly white, maybe a few other people of color, but not a ton that looked like me. And my, clothes were different. My food smelled different. My parents didn't pack me peanut butter and jelly on a white bread sandwich like everybody else had. I had keema paratha in like a metal tin, right? And everyone's like, what is that stinky thing that you're eating? So, growing up, it was always kind of odd one out. And my childhood into teenagerhood story, I think, which is going to be recognized by a lot of children of, immigrant or mixed families, is assimilation. I didn't want to be different. I wanted so much to just feel like I didn't stand out, that my edges didn't stick out. And there was this constant tension between the me that I could feel that I was inside and what felt like the me that other people were seeing. And so when we think about awkwardness, kind of an early definition I'll give for the context of this conversation is awkwardness is what we feel when the person we believe ourselves to be, our true selves, is temporarily at odds. There's a gap between that person and the person that they see on display. So the person that they see externally. Yes, go ahead, Whitney.
And is that because we've intentionally put something else on display, like a sort of false self or a fit-in self?
Yeah, it can be. So what's interesting about awkwardness is there's kind of two buckets. It can be in, life's unplanned, unexpected circumstances. So I'm walking down the street, I trip over my own 2 feet. And I'm like, oh my God, people think I can't walk, right? I'm so clumsy. People think I don't know how to walk. We didn't plan that. That's just one of the awkward moments where we feel a little embarrassed, a little flushed that we didn't plan for. But then every time we're trying to put ourselves out there to make a new friend in high school, to speak up in a meeting, to advocate for ourselves in a time that we've never done it before. Anytime we put ourselves in a place of personal growth or professional risk-taking, there's a chance that we're going to increase the odds of that awkwardness. So that's a little bit of a planned awkwardness. So it's both. It can be in life's unplanned moments and in life's planned moments.
Can you tell me about a point where you started to embrace the awkward, or you kind of made that shift? Because you had a really nice in your TED Talk, one of them, you talked about, I didn't even correct my boss when he called me Hannah, I think it was, instead of Henna.
Helen.
Helen.
I'm gonna
even worse.
It's an awkward moment, Iris. You called it
wrong. Believe me, I get Hannah more often than not, so she's not wrong.
Yeah, like Hannah or Helen, and then you just kind of were like, well, I'll just keep answering to that name. But when did you? Because I think this is a great moment to say to the audience, I'm sure we all have those moments. So I'd love the audience to think about, like, as you're hearing your story, when is the moment? And then for you, what's the moment that you're like, you know what? I think I'm just going to flip the script here.
Yeah. So twofold. I would say, up until middle school and high school, and people who meet me now have a hard time believing this, I would have paid any price for the approval of my peers. I very much just wanted people to like me. I wanted to fit in. I would shapeshift. I would have, again, I'd pay you money to be a Jennifer or Samantha or whatever it was back then, right? I didn't want to be Henna with the Pakistani food. I wanted to be, kind of the same as everyone else. And when I got to college, I think, as is many people's experience, you start to meet your people a little bit. And these are people that stuck out and had their jagged edges showing and embraced them. And I was like, oh, we can do that. Right? We can do that. And so I slowly started to find a little bit of that confidence, but, on my terms. But I'll tell you, the thing that really made me focus on this, start studying it, and also start embracing it is really one day the realization that with life and with any sort of personal and professional growth, you don't get to avoid taking risks, right? You don't get to avoid it if you're trying to grow. But what shook me was the realization that even when you avoid awkwardness, that is a risk, right? Because it's either the risk of taking this situation and moving in the direction that you want it to go, or it's the risk of missing an opportunity, of, in the case of my name, abandoning myself and what was important to me. And I don't get to choose no risk. Like either way, there's going to be one. And I think once I had that sort of realization that I now have a choice of which one I want to take, but not taking one is still a choice. Inaction is still a choice. It made me a lot more intentional about, I have to choose a path here. Which one is it going to be? And so I started to learn about it and study it. And it was fascinating once I started that path.
It is fascinating. And I love how you pepper in all the research in your TEDx talks. And I know you have done that even more deeply in the book. One thing I'm curious about, we've got the athletic model. We talk about untraining. You talk about conditioning. So because awkward is something people tend to avoid, I'm curious about, do people come to you and you're like, I want to work on my awkward. Yay, and I'm going to pay you to do it, right?
Yeah.
And when they do, like, how do you work with them? How do you help them embrace it and condition?
Yeah. They don't say, I want to work on my awkward. They recognize themselves in the word, but what they ask for is actually something a little different. So quickly, I'll make the distinction. Awkwardness can be either a state, I feel awkward right now, or some people will describe themselves as awkward as a trait, right? I am awkward. I am socially awkward. So what's interesting about it, though, is that there's no such thing as factual awkwardness in either case. It's subjective. It's up to someone else to deem it so, right? It's up to someone to say, I'm awkward. It's up to someone to say, this situation is awkward. There's no such thing as factually awkward as it relates to the emotion of awkwardness. So what people ask me for isn't typically, sometimes when they identify it in themselves as a trait of, gosh, I feel socially awkward all the time. Sometimes they will say, hey, that's something I want to work on. But often what I hear is, and I really want to feel more confident or be more courageous or take more risks or be more authentic. Usually it's one of those four. And there's something in the way of that. Right? There's something that's standing in the way of that. And what we come to realize is the way they try to run from awkwardness or avoid awkward situations based on something that's happened in the past is what contributes to their inability to achieve those things. So it's sort of an obstacle, a block to those outcomes for them instead.
And are you ever working with the block, like in a focused way, or are you just sort of conditioning the other muscles?
Yeah, no. So I'm glad you asked that question. So, in the arc of the book and the way I work with clients one-on-one around this is absolutely, there's no jumping straight to conditioning. That's to me, putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, right? So there has to be some deep self-awareness work, some deep reflection work that happens first. So, in your language, it's the untraining or it's the, kind of recalibrating what is true. And so, I talk about 3 different mental blocks that people tend to have specifically around the emotion of awkwardness. And so, just example, one of them is, only the weak and insecure feel awkward, right? Emotionally weak and insecure. Confident people don't feel this. False, completely false. In fact, the research debunks that wholeheartedly. The most confident people do not eliminate awkwardness. It's not something that can be eliminated. You would have to have a crystal ball. You would have to have a situation where all of life's future outcomes were certain. It's never happening for any of us. And in fact, emotionally strong people are the ones who invite awkwardness into their lives. And so it's a lot of reframing and rewriting what it means, what these blocks are around it first. And then once that has really been, internalized and understood, then we can work into the tactical, actionable steps that one can take to condition and to bring these moments into their lives.
Do you remember the first risk that you took or embracing awkward? Like, do you remember that? Or maybe you have a thought about a story of, I really knew I was taking those risks when I did X.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot for me. I'll tell you the one that comes up most prominently, but just for context setting, I was a beginner a lot growing up. Again, immigrant parents. I was the first in the United States, and they're like, land of opportunity. She can try anything she wants. And so my parents were like, you're going to try everything, right? Like you're going to try everything. You're going to try jazz dance. You're going to try soccer. You're going to try this. You're going to try that. I tried everything and stuck with very little. I was, perpetual beginner, not because I didn't want to stick with it, but I think more that my parents were like, I feel like you should try all these things. And so perpetual beginner was a lot of my story. And at the time, it felt like crap all the time because I just sucked at everything and never really got good at anything. But looking back now, I realize what a gift I was given in the practice in being this sort of beginner at things. And so as I started my career, I was a little less afraid than most people to say, you know what, being a beginner is something I can do. But the biggest risk I think I took that felt the hardest at the time was I graduated from University of Delaware with a degree in finance. I went to Ernst & Young. My first job was actually as a Big Four public accountant, which made my immigrant parents very happy and sucked my soul out of my body every single day. So I did it for 2.5, 3 years and was like, I hate this so much. I had made some of my best friends, but I hated it. And so I ended up pivoting my career to staffing, which the company I worked for is a wonderful $2 billion company, but comes with no name recognition, in the sense that immigrant parents would love to hear. Was 100% commissions, which had my parents terrified, right? They were supportive, but terrified. And that to me felt like a huge risk on multiple fronts. It was a very different career. I'd never worked in sales. I'd never worked 100% commissions. And this is coming from a family that was, working class immigrants, middle class, worked their way up. And money was always a tight topic around us. So to go 100% commissions was like, what are you thinking? Why would you do this? It's not stable, So that was a risk. And also it felt really at odds with the identity that I grew up in, which was, high achiever, straight A. She got into a name brand company. She got into a name brand, this and that. And that was the first time I went into something where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to be exposed as clumsy, fumbly, stumbly, messy, like all the things that I don't want people to think I am, but I'm about to threaten to show them all those bumpy edges of the things that I don't know how to do. And that scared the hell out of me. But I did it anyway. I just took a leap. I tried it and ended up being there for 14 years. So I'm glad I did, but scared the piss out of me for sure.
Sorry, I've probably jumped in, Whitney, there, but I wrote a couple words that you used down because they kind of resonated with me. It sounds, because you said I took the leap, and you talk about the cringe chasm. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like you had to take the leap over the cringe chasm. Can you define that for the audience?
Yeah. So the cringe chasm, and I introduce it in my TEDx, but then I talk about it a lot more in the book. It's really this moment that you reach. So when you think about two cliffs, right, there's going to be two cliffs. I'm standing on one side. Over there is all of my goals, all of my dreams on the other side. And on the side that I'm standing on, I call it the approval mindset, which is everything I do when I'm standing right here, I know people will like it, right? My parents will approve. My friends will approve. I'm guaranteed approval from the people that I work for or report to because she knows what she's doing in that industry or in that career. It feels good over here. It feels safe over here. But I know that things that I want are over there. And I call that other cliff the improvement mindset. The things where I know I've got edges where I want to grow. I know I need to get there. But in order to get over there, there's going to be a little bit of teeth clenching. I don't like the way this feels. I don't like the way this is going to look, right? Like while I'm in the air, it's going to be awkward. It's going to be ugly. There's a good chance it's going to feel like I'm getting it wrong. I'm going to probably trip over my own 2 feet. But if that's where I want to go, I have to jump that cringe chasm, right? I have to understand that this feeling in my stomach, this wash over my body is just part of what comes with this jump. And so in order to get there, it's, again, not fighting it or not waiting for it to go away. I think oftentimes when we're like, ugh, this gut feeling, this pain in my belly is telling me I'm not ready. Or it could be, but more often than not, it's telling you you're nervous and you're scared and it matters to you. And so it's jumping that cringe chasm to get to the other side so that you can keep moving. But so many times people get stuck at the edge of that approval mindset because it's paralyzing. There's shackles on your ankles over there. It's really tough to get to the other side, but it's necessary, even if you have to cringe your way through it to the other side.
I love the term approval mindset. And I think we haven't named it as such, but we are talking about that a lot in our conversations. And, you're talking about sort of making a leap towards a better version of oneself and more expression, more aligned. But a lot of, I think the ways that we talk about going against the approval mindset is to have boundaries and to say no and to take care of yourself and rest a little bit more. So can you talk about that and how you work with your clients around it, if it's any different?
Yeah. No, yeah, I love the distinction there. And this is a definite both end, right? I don't think I'm very clear about this in coaching too. Not every cringe chasm needs to be jumped, right? Not every single one needs to be jumped. So there needs to be some directionality. So, first things first is, we do this work a lot, Iris and I, with Limitless is, mining for your values. What are your values? And the cringe chasm is first and foremost only worth jumping if it's directionally aligned with your values, right? Not every chasm is worth jumping. So it needs to be directional for sure. And it needs to make sense, right? You have to want it enough. So I think sometimes people, I admire people who are just like perpetual risk takers. Like, I'll jump out of a plane tomorrow, right? If that's not my value, then that's not a chasm worth jumping. Sometimes the hardest work, sometimes the hardest cringe chasm to jump is boundary creation, right? So I've had conversations. I lead a couple women in leadership groups. For them, their cringe chasm is actually standing up to the person that's constantly disrespecting their boundaries in the spirit of improvement. So, visually it gets a little confusing, but their chasm moment, their jump moment actually is the speaking up or the enforcement of the boundaries. So in a way, they're still jumping, but it's jumping their version of what's difficult for them. And that might be allowing this to stay this, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm gesturing on a podcast. I'm holding my arms in a container, right? Allowing this to stay this for them is their cringe chasm moment. So it just depends on what it is for the individual.
Yeah. It sounds like the bottom line is it disrupts the approval mindset.
Yes, I think that, and that's hard. I know you both know that. I've listened to some of your episodes. That is so easy to say and so hard to shake off. And that's where that untraining, that self-reflection, where does this come from? What's the origin? If that's not properly unpacked, then the rest of it still feels like an uphill climb for sure.
Yeah, because I think it's important you talk about all of the narratives that led you to that approval mindset. And like you said in different podcasts, we talk about it too. We just had Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin, who I know you know. She does a lot of that work with imposter syndrome, is knowing like where do those narratives come from. And so I just wanted the audience to also realize like you might have just said it, but those are things you worked on. You're like, oh, what are the things my parents told me was the right way, right? Because the immigrants, there's a lot of fear. It's a new country. There's a lot they want to show people. So there's a lot of these narratives, and I have it too, right? So I have it a tiger mom, a Chinese mom, like external validation is very important, right? How people perceive you is super, super important. So I think that is important just to point out is, although she kind of said it in 2 sentences, that's work you did of like, oh, here are the validation points that I was given. Here are the approval points that I was given. But now what are the things that I want to validate myself by? And what are the things that I really want that are on the other side of the chasm? I think it's also, I do also talk about dissonance. Like when people begin to feel that dissonance and they come to coaching, they're like, I'm really feeling like my behaviors aren't really matching where I want to go or what I want to do or who I am.
Yeah.
And so I think that's especially true maybe for people with this similar background. For me, that was especially true. So when I asked about like, when did you begin to shift? That shift happened for me at that time because I really felt a dissonance between like, okay, here's what my parents gave me as like the approval mindset, but man, do I want to go to the other side? Do I want to do something totally different? And I had to listen to that dissonance. And I do see, for me, that's when it's time to look at those narratives.
Yeah, I think the one thing that struck me as you were talking is maybe one adjustment we can all agree to make on language, which is, I didn't learn to embrace the awkward past tense, right? And I haven't sorted it out already. Still daily, right? Daily, this stuff comes up. In fact, yesterday I posted a LinkedIn post about how I went to a big book show last week. I went to a big US book show, something that was sponsored by my publisher, and all of the healthy self-doubt. I know it was healthy, but still self-doubt was huge. And I'm telling you, I haven't felt that way in a while. So out of place. And, literary folks are a little different than speakers. They're a little more introverted, a little bit more, they kind of knew each other. I didn't know anybody. I thought I would be there with my publisher and my director of marketing, neither of whom could come at the last minute. So I went by myself, didn't know a soul. Again, these folks are a little more introverted than other groups that I'm accustomed to being in. I felt like hell. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Every bit of awkwardness, every bit of do I belong here, every bit of my bumpy edges are showing. It all came roaring back. And so, embracing the awkwardness is something that in some ways I have gotten good at. And in other ways, I really have to anchor into the recognition that in every inflection point of my life, in every growth transition, when I'm trying something new, now it's not that I've conquered it, but it becomes an expectation and an anticipation and a readiness for this is how I'm going to feel. Now, in this situation, I knew it. I knew it was going to feel that way. I don't think I expected the magnitude of which it would feel that way. And, was lucky enough to call some close friends, some shared colleagues of Iris and I to say, hey, I need a pep talk. Like, I need a pep talk. Remind me who I am. But you can't avoid it and conquer it. It is kind of this constant ongoing, every inflection point, it's going to rear up again. So it's just better to be ready for it instead of that.
It's reminding me of our conversation with Karin, right? So you're talking about at inflection points, whether they, you chose them or you didn't choose them, or you're intending to create them. You're going to feel these feelings. So you might as well be ready for them. And it reminds me of Karin talking about, like, when the Olympics end, you're going to get down and sad. And so you might as well be prepared for it. So I like this idea of preparing for it. So I know coaching's so context dependent. And so it might be a tough question. And maybe you just coach one of us, but could you give us some examples of people who are ready to embrace the awkward because they're in one of those transition points, inflection points? What are some examples of things you have them work on or focus on to condition?
No, I love the question. And it is coaching dependent. It is person dependent. But generally speaking, here's kind of the wisdom I give. Mental muscle, like every muscle, is something that can be trained, right? Understanding that there's nuance, but it's something that can be developed and trained. And interestingly, even the extroverted among us, those that really don't struggle socially, awkwardness is an emotion that tends to be used more in social context. Even those of us that didn't struggle with it ever in our lives, there's, now research that's come out that following the pandemic, everyone's social muscles atrophied a bit, right? The introverted for sure, but even the extroverted that normally had no difficulty in social situations were like, what?
I totally agree. You're totally right.
I felt it. I remember my first big networking event and I was like, I forgot how to people.
I know.
I don't know how to be right now. And so it's interesting. It really illuminated how social mental muscle can atrophy. And there's research that's about polar explorers and astronauts and other occupations that are generally more isolated that validates how social muscle can atrophy. And so I share that as background because one of the best things we can do to prepare or to ready is to keep social muscles active, right? And so if one of your goals is to, let's say your big goal is to have a tough salary negotiation with a senior leader, that's the risk. That's the big professional risk. Then your preparation, your conditioning for what inevitably will feel like an exposing, slightly awkward, uncomfortable conversation is practicing keeping those social muscles active by talking more about salary with a trusted group of peers, right? With a small circle that you feel like you can have these conversations with, maybe with one person who is not the deciding person, but is slightly more senior. So you can get some of those words out. But it's really creating opportunities intentionally because they don't pop up on their own, intentionally to flex those social muscles with people. Can't just practice in front of a mirror. It's not enough, right? But with other people so that when the big moment comes, when the big show comes, it's not the first time. It's not the first time you've had to flex these social muscles. And in the hybrid world, it takes super intention. We have to reach out in a way that we never had to before because we're not, rubbing shoulders the way we were in the office before. So that's some of, just an example of how people can start to prime themselves ahead.
I love that. So you're not going to, if you were working with me, you wouldn't tell me to attach toilet paper to my shoe, get dressed up and walk across a big.
I mean, if that's what you think will happen, if that's something you're prone to, then go ahead. But,
I am prone to that. That happens to me. Could you give us a couple more examples? I love that.
Yeah, there's a few exercises I encourage people to do. So, one of them is part of the work is just normalizing embarrassment, awkwardness, cringy moments, especially now, again, where we're not all working together side by side. Lots of times our cringy, embarrassing moments happen in a silo where people don't see them. And so when that happens, again, our brains are tricksters. We think we're the only ones. We're the only ones who are doing these dumb things or, sending the wrong file or forwarding this confidential information. No, we're not. But just nobody's around us to be like, oh my God, can you believe what I just did? And it doesn't feel important enough to create space to talk about it. So we don't. And that feeds the narrative even more that I'm the only one who does dumb stuff like this, embarrassing stuff like this. So it's really, you can call it, embarrassing moment, brainstorms. We've had people do Post-it notes on walls virtually. It can be just, hey, at the top of every meeting, everyone share a misstep, right? Everyone share a screw up story. Everyone share an embarrassing moment. And research actually supports that when you share things like this, again, not long, I'm not saying monopolize half of your meeting, But at the top of a meeting, when you share stuff like this, it actually has the immediate effect of lowering people's emotional barrier, which actually leads to more ideas in the rest of the meeting, more creative ideas, more generative ideas, and it actually wildly increases trust and team satisfaction.
So awkwardness and innovation is your next TEDx talk.
It is. It is. I mean, honestly, this is where, people are like, well, what's the application here? I'm like, if you don't embrace awkwardness, this is where innovation and creativity die. You have to. They're sisters. They're the other side of the coin. Like, you have to. And so now we just have to be really intentional about carving out space. So that's another way you can do it.
Iris, you have this beautiful way of being like, wait, you need to say that again. I love it when Iris does that, but I'm going to do it. Henna, can you say that again about, I can't do it.
I like your Iris impression.
I can't do it. I can't just get this wonderful lower register. Iris, do it for me, please.
Well, everything she's saying is I want to talk about the risks of not taking risks. Right. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about if we don't take the risks, if we're not honest with ourselves, if we don't embrace our own good awkward, what happens? What happens to us? What happens to teams? What happens to leaders?
Yeah, I'll make this very real, and I don't know if he'll ever listen to this, but Colin Henderson and I, he's a teammate of ours at Limitless Minds.
He better listen to this.
I don't know if he's going through that, but we've started to work on some business projects together, just separately. We're kind of business partners on a couple things, and we communicate very differently. It's we love each other deeply as friends, but we communicate very differently. He's like one word on text. I'm like saying everything I think. We have what most would deem a mismatch in a lot of ways of working. And so one thing that has become abundantly clear to us is that if we don't have the awkward conversation about what we're thinking or feeling about something, the way something is going, it leads to not just, resentment and frustration, but we stop being creative. Ideas stop because we feel like our communication falls off. And so on numerous occasions, and, frankly, just to pat ourselves on the back, I'm really proud of both of us for this. Like, neither of us really in the past would have run forth into awkward conversations. We're both, recovering people pleasers and it's daily work. But, the other day there was something and I said, hey, I feel like you said you were going to call back and you didn't. Right. And I just need you to know that this made me feel like this thing we're working on wasn't important to you. And in his world, he didn't realize how important it was to me that happened that day. Right. I think it was sort of like, we'll get to it. And B, I think he's just not used to everything feeling so urgent, where again, this is a growth edge for me. Maybe it wasn't urgent, but it's by making space for these definitely awkward conversations, even amongst friends, that our ability to take more risks and be more creative with ideas and try things and toss things out. We have to have that clear path of communication. And if not for those awkward conversations, I would hold back. I'm just telling you personally, I don't know about him. I would hold back. I would say, well, it doesn't matter. What's the point? Why would I even bring this up? Like, I don't even know if it's going to go anywhere. I would hold back. So it had to exist in order for continued risk-taking, innovation, creativity to occur. But there was no way to untangle those two. Like, they had to exist in tandem. And I see that many ways in teams and organizations.
Well, I want to talk about organizations. Oh my God, words. But I do think what you're saying is trust. That if I'm awkward and I have that honest conversation, if he's awkward and embraces the honest conversation, and it wasn't attacking, it was just, I felt when this happened. It's not like you did this to me. It was, I felt this awkwardness, or I felt this. You are actually building trust. And he's also learning, and you're learning about each other. Like, how does she like to be worked with, talked to, et cetera. So I think it's a great opportunity because it's both trust and also growth. And the cool thing is, you also talked about a growth edge for yourself. Is not only that, having that conversation made me realize maybe I'm putting urgency where there isn't urgency. So you start to learn about yourself, because we always talk about that. It's like, how do I know what I want to work on? What kind of feedback? But this is literal feedback in real time. Yeah. So it's growth and opportunity to be more trusting each other. So I just love that story. Do you have any thoughts on like the bigger organizational or teams, or if you're a leader, how do we embrace the awkward as a leader? Because we do also know like you want to be vulnerable, but not tell like your entire story. But how can leaders embrace the good awkward?
Yeah. So kind of as an extension to that story, but then looking at it more holistically, there's a couple things that I'll call out, an area where I think there's a little missed opportunity, and then how I would do it better. So a missed opportunity is I love when teams set norms. I love when they say, hey, let's, write our own operating manual about how we best like to work. Are you a text person? You an email person? You a Slack person? Colin Henderson would much rather pick up the phone, right? He's like, Henna, too much text, too much email. Just call me, right? Like he's 95 years old in that way. So, everybody's got their norms, and I agree with that. I think what sometimes we gloss over is, again, he and I have done this work about how we like to operate. And despite that, understanding that part of the journey to working well as a team is through experimentation. So despite the knowing, it doesn't avoid the fact that we still, to this day, sometimes have to have awkward conversations about the way things work. And I think part of what we forget to do is the operating manual isn't the problem solve 100%. Right? It's part of it. It's a start to the conversation. But understanding team dynamics is there's going to be awkward conversations. We need to embrace, task conflict. And if that bubbles into relationship conflict, then, embrace that too. But for teams, again, what I try to encourage leaders to do when it relates to this stuff is, bring to light opportunities for, struggle and misstep as often as you can, and encourage teams to bring up, especially hybrid and remotely, encourage teams to bring up missteps or mistakes or, cringe moments or whatever early, because part of what gets people in trouble is they hold it. And again, because they think they're the only one, they hold it. And then their team member is surprised later about this thing that happened that maybe has downline effects. So bring stuff up early. And also, again, just normalize, even if we put all these operating manuals together and they are beautiful and perfect looking, that in this hybrid world, we're social beings. We're not predictable. We're going to have things that land differently for one, again, based on our conditioning. So I am someone who was rewarded my whole life for being urgent and spicy and fiery and blunt. And here I have a business partner who is extremely chill, who is like, this isn't a big deal, relax, right? And so for me, I'm interpreting, again, even with the operating manual, this doesn't matter. That's a story that couldn't be farther from the truth. He's completely invested in what we're doing. It matters to him deeply, but it's a story I'm telling myself. So the awkwardness that accompanies team dynamics, I think we just need to bring more of that conversation to the forefront, and not only have it be something that they can, maybe expect, but you will expect. Normalize the fact that this will be part of the growth path as a team, that this is going to happen, and lean into these conversations. Don't try to eliminate them.
Do you think that the leader of a team has to be pretty comfortable with their own awkward in order to offer this to their team?
This is my opinion, and I think the research corroborates it. Yes. I think any team, I hope that we're starting to move away from, the Mad Men-esque era of leaders feeling like they have to put on this show of perfection. The data supports that when, not just leaders, but when people actually express awkward discomfort, that it makes their people that they work with perceive them as more kind, more trustworthy, more generous. And people are like, well, how the hell is that? Because their lack of perfection puts other people at ease. Mm-hmm. So their lack of perfection puts other people at ease. I share a story in the book about, I work with a client who works for a big telecom company, and the CEO of the company was this very buttoned up, very kind of corporate, closed off type who never made a mistake, who never had a misstep, who never had anything, the egg would never crack. And during the pandemic, when we all got thrown into Zoom and nobody had a chance to curate their Zoom background, he would get on an all hands call and his daughter's pulling at his sleeve and the dog is barking and it's just a mess. It's a disaster. And the company loved it. They loved it. They're like, oh my God, thank God this guy isn't made of stone, right? His approval rating went way up. Trust from his executive team went way up. And so if you don't let all of those edges show, what you create is, whether you mean to or not, an expectation that everybody needs to show up like that. And you know what they're going to do? Their missteps, their mistakes, the things that went wrong, they're going to get brushed under the rug, and that's going to create much bigger problems downline. So we have to model it as leaders for sure.
Can you talk about how you coach people who maybe want to embrace this more, but they work in an organization that is dissonant with the idea of embracing awkward?
Yes. So, psychological safety plays a huge part in this. I'm very much team dip a toe in the water. Don't go ahead and blast your big missteps publicly unless you know it's okay to do so. And obviously there's systemic things where, women, and especially BIPOC women, women of color, the unfortunate truth is that they are disproportionately scrutinized. And what some would refer to as confidence is still often made to need to look like flawlessness, because we are still living in a system that supports the structures created by white men, so this is real. And I don't want to gloss over everyone, just, let their freak flag fly and it'll be okay. It's not okay in every environment. So in that case, the safest thing to do is test psychological safety. So similar to what we talked about before, maybe if you've got an idea that you're not sure how it's going to land, it could fall on an awkward silence. Test it in a small group. Test it with one leader that you trust. See how that lands first before you take it to a broader group. But it's, kind of interval based. Don't just jump in and kind of let it all out if you feel like it's going to be held against you. And also just, kind of scanning your environment. Are there other people who have been able to share these missteps, these cringe moments, these blunders without repercussion? Then that can be a sign. It depends, but it can be a sign that it might be safe for you to do so too. But again, in the hybrid world, it really requires a deeper level of intentionality to scan, because it's harder to do sitting by ourselves in our home office.
I think this is a good point to talk about. On our podcast, we talk about being curious and calling a friend. And you did talk about calling a friend in that awkward moment. Yeah. And you have a lovely words for this is hype squad. So can you talk a little bit about how to build a hype squad, who's on that hype squad? And because you even talked about like in your vicinity, if you're trying to have psychological safety, maybe you have some people on your hype squad that are around you that can help you do that. So how does one build a hype squad?
Yeah, I love it. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So, in the context of the second TedX and sort of the way I talk about it professionally is, I call it a professional hype squad. We can have personal hype squads too, but your professional hype squad is a group of people who you trust deeply, who want you to win. They want you to win, but they will always hold you accountable to not just the things that are hard, but really for the hype squad purposes, they'll help you inflate and celebrate the things that maybe we'd push under the rug a little bit more regularly. So, obviously you got a promotion, hype squad activate, easy. We know that one. I survived this really awkward moment in a meeting. Hype squad needs to activate there too, right? Like how can we create moments to celebrate those things and not just the obvious low-hanging fruit? And so how do we cultivate and nurture one? Honestly, one person at a time is the easy short answer. And the longer answer, which seems counterintuitive, but to me has been the best way for me to create it, is to be that person relentlessly for other people. Just constantly, shouting out, every time somebody shares something with me and they're like, yeah, this happened. It was cool. I'm like, nope, you are not allowed to just hurry up and gloss through that, right? Stop. Tell me more about that. And as I practice building that muscle for others, it just inevitably comes back to me in that way. It's infectious, it's contagious. And so as you're trying to curate yours, if there's people that you just really vibe with, you feel like you have that trust with, be that person for other people. And it's bound to come around. It almost always does.
I can't stop smiling because I'm dating myself here, but I remember the cartoon with all the superheroes. It was like Wonder Twins activate. And I love this. Hype squad activate.
Yeah. I need mine. I honestly, it's too, you guys as coaches, you can't read the label from inside the jar, whatever that expression is. There's so many days where I've tried to self-coach. I've tried to say, Henna, gosh, you're beating yourself up over XYZ. The inner critic comes out about every negative emotion, and awkwardness is not exempt from that. It can rear its head, and I need other people to hold up the mirror and tell me the truth and remind me who the hell I am.
Yeah, I think
what were you going to say, Iris?
Well, two things. One is, When I was talking to someone else and she's a super achiever, I think a lot of times we feel like we have to do so many things on our own, and it is a skill set. Some people do it naturally of reaching out. But I also wanted to say, like, part of maybe your chasm is learning to ask for help. Or are you pointing at yourself, Henna? Tell me more.
I am. Read me like a book, Iris. Yeah. That's one of my biggest edges because, again, just, I love my parents. We're very close. So I don't want to, I'm grateful for everything they did for me growing up. But my mom in particular is extremely self-sufficient. She does not rely on anyone. And, we can call it a combination of wanting to stay in control of things, but also just not asking for help ever. And so my conditioning and what I'm really working to untrain is that you can be strong and self-sufficient and still ask for help. And so that is, nailing my cringe chasm to this day. It's still really hard for me to say to someone, I really don't have the capacity to do this myself. I'm exhausted. Can you help me? That's still hard, but I'm really proud to say in the last year or two, I've gotten increasingly better. But it's a muscle to build. And the more it comes out of my mouth, the easier it is. But I'm going to lie to you and say, or I wouldn't lie to you by saying that it's easy. There's still a conditioning bit that I'm working through.
What's the narrative behind it? Like, what's the belief? Like, if I ask for help, then what happens? Like, is it admitting that I can't do something, or what is it?
Yeah, mostly that. I think if I need help, then it means I'm incapable of handling it myself. And also just the narrative of achievement that I was fed most of my life is, if you do it without help and you are successful, gold star, right? Like, you did it. You earned the glory and the guts and all that. But not everything needs to be a Herculean effort to get the glory, and that's something that I'm, again, trying still on a daily basis to trust and to believe that it doesn't have to be a struggle in order to be a success. But that's the narrative that I grew up around to a degree. And so it's hard to undo.
Well,
but I'm working on it.
We would agree with that narrative. I think that's a lot of the untraining we are trying to share with the world.
Yeah, I've heard you guys say things like that in the past, or versions of that, right? It doesn't have to be exhausting and cumbersome and uncomfortable to still be worthy of celebration. And that's a hard, it's easy to say, it's easy to hear, but for those of us who lived that for a really long time, it does require intentionality to untrain. And I still am trying.
And maybe the struggle is in the cringe chasm, right? Mm-hmm. Versus the effort muscle, right? Maybe that's where the hard is.
Yeah. I love when people, I have a friend, Sarah, who she's got 3 children. One is neurotypical, and then her second 2 are neurodivergent. They are both on the autism spectrum and have apraxia, which means they can't speak. So she has a very difficult job as a parent. And what her phrase is that I just love so much is she says, I don't let the hard be the story that I tell. Right. So it's not that we ignore the hard. It's not that we avoid the hard, but we get to decide if that's the story that I tell, right? The success doesn't have to be so struggle focused, right? You can have a success that's smaller, that's not struggle focused. You can have something that was a big struggle that's not directly tied to the success. But I think sometimes because of our narratives, we get really hung up on, if it didn't feel Herculean and effortful, I know that's one of Iris's words. If it didn't feel that way, was it worth it? Actually, yeah.
What are some good ways to celebrate when you embrace the good awkward?
Yeah, it's personal, but the simplest one is just verbal, right? I think verbal connection is important. I think, let's for a moment get off the digital, get off. I'll still send a celebratory text like, you did that or whatever, we'll do that. But nothing will make someone's day and feel seen, heard, and appreciated more than that energy and the voice of like, hold on, you badass, right? Can we you got through that. That was hard. And you got through that. How cringe like hell, but here you are on the other side, surviving it, thriving it, whatever. So just simple, free verbal affirmation. I can't say enough. And again, when something is particularly difficult, I just think, again, we don't often give enough credit to small gestures of appreciation. So there's a recent HBR article I love because I've always believed in this. Now there's a word for it. They call it microvalidation. So there's microaggressions, and sort of the counterpoint to that is microvalidation. Not everything needs to be, a cake and a pizza party, but it's just those moments of, I saw you in there. You crushed that. Like, I know that was hard. So congrats, little things delivered consistently are so high impact. And again, just in the environment that we're in now, we have to really over-index on it, because those little, I can't just, Iris, as much as I would love to, I can't just give her a little fist bump after a Limitless Live and be like, done. I can't. So I have to go make a really intentional effort to say, great live today, or, oh my gosh, loved it. Or, let me jump on for, even if it's for 5 minutes, so that she feels seen and that I'm trying to be supportive. So just don't underestimate the power of microvalidations. It doesn't always have to be a big, giant thing. Little things accumulated become big things, and it helps us build that mental muscle.
I just want to say here,
go ahead.
No kudos on Slack, please.
Fine. Yeah. No back slaps. High fives.
Yeah. Slack kudos always drove me crazy, but some people like it, but I just think you're absolutely right. Like having a verbal, like, hey, and like having someone visually see you, that solidifies that win so much more. Sorry, Whitney. I think I talked.
Well, in the spirit of awkward, we keep talking over each other. So I'm going to embrace it. I'm just going to embrace it. So I have a final question, and I've been trying to think of what my final question is, because I'm so curious about so much of what you've talked about. But my final question is, Iris and I were talking this morning about our preteen daughters, and you talk in your TEDx talk about how, this starts in adolescence, where it's like, this is how you should be, or we get this better, greater, stronger sense of how we should be. So if we've got preteen daughters and we want to condition them to be comfortable with awkward, how do you suggest we approach that? Maybe an example or a global.
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete tactic, and then maybe some more general guidance. So my daughter's 13. She's finishing 7th grade. Talk about awkward, right? Yeah. Middle school years are no joke. My son is almost 11, and he's finishing 5th grade. So tactical, just right out of the gate, one of our dinner table questions is in the spirit of having them embrace the awkward. So we have 3 dinner table questions. What's the best part of your day? What did you learn today? And where did you have a moment to embrace the butterflies? Or where did you have butterflies today? So the last question is let's call it a kid version of, where did you find a moment that was a little bit at your awkward edge where you kind of did it anyway? Right. And maybe it's that you spoke up for someone, or maybe in the classroom. My daughter is a bit more shy. My son has my personality. My daughter is a little more, I don't want the spotlight on me. And so a lot of times her butterflies answer is, the teacher asked for XYZ and I didn't want to raise my hand, but I did. And I spoke up and I shared my answer. Right. But essentially what I'm trying to condition in them slowly is this understanding, essentially the equivalent of little cringe-tasm moments, right? How do we understand that when we're trying to be better at something, speaking up in class, being more visible, that these butterflies you feel are not something that you should be trying to get rid of, that you just need to get used to them, that you just need to befriend them. And so by asking this question, my hope is that they, A, start to believe that it's natural and normal, but B, I'm trying to prime them to look for those moments, because they know mom and dad are going to ask. So the more I can prime them, now every day they don't have one. Sometimes it's, I don't think I really had one today. But they know that the days that they do have one, that we're celebrating.
I love it.
They're like, all right, I love it. Just little verbal affirmation. So that's a tactical. And I think just more broadly is, again, I wish I could give you some magic tip, but as it relates to preteens and teens, especially daughters, what I'm finding is the more I can normalize the awkwardness of social interactions, a book that I don't know if I have it next to me, that I can't recommend enough. It's a book called 14 Talks by Age 14. And I believe the author is Michelle Icard. So if anyone's got preteens or early teens, 14 Talks by Age 14. This book has given me so much language to use. But what I've learned most, at least for that generation, is about the nature of social relationships. And I think what's good to know about that age is that the expectation that the movies are wrong. You're not going to have your best friend as a preteen or teen, your best friend for life. That's how the movies make it sound. But that social relationships are very transient, and that these years are actually about learning how to make friends rather than it is about creating your lifelong friendships. and that learning how to make friends can be awkward, right? This is new, but just normalizing that expectation loudly and as often as we can about this is how it does feel for middle schoolers. You're not the only one that doesn't have your lifelong bestie here, has made those situations easier to navigate and helps her embrace them a bit more, I think.
I love that answer.
I'm on Amazon buying that book right now. So
it's the best. It's like my preteen teen Bible right now.
I love it. I love it. So tell us about how we are going to be able to embrace Good Awkward as a book. When is it coming out?
Yeah.
How do I pre-order it? How do I get it? How do I buy multiple copies? Can you sign mine? I have all the questions.
Yes. I love you for asking. It's publishing on September 26th is the official published date. It is available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, everywhere books are sold. If you like indiebookshop.org, you can get it there through Indie. It's got some pretty great endorsements already, so I'm pretty proud of it. The former editor of HBR just gave me a really glowing endorsement. And what I'm most proud of is it is not, again, another get comfortable being uncomfortable book. There's a very fresh perspective. I don't know that anyone's ever explored this emotion in this way. So I can say with confidence, you will learn something new about yourself, about the others in your life. You will laugh. It is in my personality 100%. I don't hold back. And so I really am proud of it. And if you were curious just about the book in general, goodawkward.com is the landing page. There's information about bulk buys. I'm doing some speaking trades for bulk orders and things. So goodawkward.com is where you can learn more about the book.
Well, you are an exquisite ambassador of the Good Awkward. I have loved having you on.
I didn't snort on this phone call, but it might still come.
Time.
We'll
There's
see.
still time.
Well,
I didn't have a unicorn costume either, but next time, round 2.
Yes. I love the unicorn costume. Well, thanks for joining us, and thanks for spending time with us and talking about the Good Awkward. I learned a ton. And what do we always say, Whitney, at the end of our podcasts?
Keep on training.
If you love what you hear, please subscribe.